The truth of the matter is, and I'm always very conscious, my job is to support cinema operators, but there's a huge ecology of people outside of those who run cinemas, be it the technology companies, seating, food and drink, ticketing, who've been in the same, if not a worse position over the last 14 months. And getting government to understand the size and the importance of that economic footprint, I think is probably, kind of on the to-do list, because it's become abundantly apparent through talking to government during this last 14 months that those companies are nowhere on the radar of government. They're not seen as part of the tech industry, but they're as important to us as is any other part of the ecology, I would say.
This is the Box Office Podcast. I'm Russ Fischer, the editorial director of the Box Office Studios, and I'm here today with Daniel Loria, the editorial director of Box Office Pro magazine, and Rebecca Pahle, the deputy editor of Box Office Pro. So today we're going to talk to Phil Clapp, the CEO of the UK Cinema Association and also the president of UNIC, which is UNIC, the European Trade Association of Cinemas. So really good conversation there. But before we get to that, we want to talk about a little bit of box office from this past weekend and a couple of other quick hit news items that have come up since we spoke to you last week. So Daniel, let's talk about what happened, or as unfortunately has been the case a couple of weekends in a row now, what didn't happen at the box office this past weekend?
Russ, it was a quiet weekend, I think, as most of us expected, with only one major new release from a studio going wide. And not surprisingly, that film ended up leading the market here in North America. Lionsgate's The Hitman's Wife's Bodyguard opened to $11.6 million. That's the weekend gross. It actually opened a couple of days before that Friday. So the actual total gross going into its first weekend release is 17 million. Easy comparison here to sort of see where we're at with the pandemic, because this is a sequel to an original film that only made $75 million in its domestic run. So it's not exactly on pace from its predecessor, but at the same time, I wonder, in ideal market conditions, how much more it could have made when we compare what its predecessor made back in 2017. In third place, we had Peter Rabbit Part 2, The Runaway, making $6.1 million from around 3,300 screens. That is now up to $20.3 million in North America. In fourth place and fifth place, it's neck and neck right now. We'll figure out what those final numbers came in, but we had The Conjuring, The Devil Made Me Do It, and Cruella, both making $5.1 million from around 3,100 screens. And guys, all the way down in sixth place, we went into detail about this title last week on the podcast, In the Heights. It doesn't look like it's going to be one of those long-running musicals. It dropped 63% in its second weekend, only grossing $4.2 million. That's the biggest drop of any movie in wide release here in the market. It's now, it hasn't even made 20 million after 2 weeks in release. Really a huge disappointment.
And as the movie landscape continues to shift, so too does the exhibition landscape in the United States. Russ, we've had some news about a chain that, as a Los Angelino, is very close to your heart. What are we looking at here?
So some of you may remember that a couple of months back, we got news that the Pacific Theaters locations in California and the Arclight Theaters chain were unlikely to reopen following closure for the pandemic. This week, we got confirmation from the company that owns Pacific and Arclight saying that they're not just doing Chapter 11 bankruptcy, which is a restructuring, but they're doing Chapter 7 bankruptcy, which is a liquidation. So the statement released said, after a year of the pandemic's devastating effect, Pacific Theaters Exhibition Corporation announced in April that it would not reopen its Arclight Cinemas and Pacific Theaters locations. Having taken steps to wind down the business, the company today is seeking protection under Chapter 7 of the Bankruptcy Code in order to liquidate its remaining assets for the benefit of its creditors. We are deeply grateful to our employees, our guests, and the film community for coming together over the past decades to create so many wonderful movie-going experiences. We're overwhelmed by the extraordinary outpouring of memories. Thank you for sharing these with us. We will miss you all. So what we know at this point is that basically all of the Arclight and Pacific Theaters locations are closed permanently, with the exception of two about which the future is uncertain, and those are the Arclight Hollywood and its associated Cinerama Dome complex. The two are really one big location, although they're often discussed in somewhat separate terms because the Cinerama Dome is a historic landmark, so there's a protected status for that building. So there have been indications that the fate of those two venues is not yet sealed, but as for all of the other locations, which include very high-grossing Pacific Theaters locations at the Open Air Grove and Glendale Americana malls, there's going to be, the doors are closed, they're going to remain closed. We've seen indications that major chains are already looking at those locations. Both the Grove and Americana Pacific locations showed up briefly in ticketing apps as AMCs about a week ago. Before that detail was those pages were quickly taken down, and there hasn't been any confirmation, but that is certainly indicative of a possible future there. We're hearing there have been reports about other major chains being interested in some of the other former Arclight locations. So nothing is set yet. Nothing has been publicly announced in an official capacity, but over the next couple of weeks, we'll probably hear a lot more. All of this is news simply because these locations are some of the highest grossing locations in California. They're important theaters in LA where a lot of the domestic film business resides. So we're very curious to see how this plays out. So let's also talk about a couple of changes in the calendar, theatrical calendar that are coming up, where in particular, Peter Jackson's new theatrical project is unfortunately no longer a theatrical project. Rebecca, what's the story there?
Indeed. So this film is called The Beatles Get Back. It's Peter Jackson drew upon a wealth of never-before-seen archival footage to create this documentary. The Beatles Get Back was supposed to come out in theaters on August 27th, and now, Russ, as you noted, it will not. It will instead debut as a 3-part series on Disney Plus throughout a series of days in November. Obviously, they've added a whole lot more archival footage. The whole thing's going to total about 6 hours.
6 hours?
I believe so. I believe it's 3 2-hour episodes.
It's The Hobbit all over again.
Peter Jackson, come on.
And clearly he edited the film. I mean, there is a, 2.5 hour version out there. Disney could very easily still put that in theaters and put the more, to use the Lord of the Rings phraseology, the extended cut on Disney Plus. However, they are choosing not to do that. It is going entirely to Disney Plus. As of this point, no theatrical iteration of that, which, is disappointing.
We need a sound effect of a chorus of boos every time a distributor pulls something that could easily have made $100 million, even with a day and date release. I mean, how much more wide appeal can you get than The Beatles? The
Beatles. The other film that had a release date change, thankfully, we do not need the boo sound effect for that one because it is still coming to theaters, albeit a bit later than we initially thought. This is Sony Picture Animation's Hotel Transylvania, Transformania, which has moved from July 23rd, 2021 to October 1st of this year. As far as we know, still going exclusively to theaters. Looking at the release date change coming so soon on the heels of Peter Rabbit 2's underwhelming debut, it's hard not to see the links there. That could certainly be a factor. Also, it's a quote unquote spooky movie. So maybe, an October release date just made more sense. It is the 4th film in the franchise. The first 2 came out, within a week of the new release. They both came out late September. The 3rd one came out in the summer. It is the highest grossing worldwide of the series, which you guess why they wanted to release Transformania in July in the first place. But this late September, early October corridor for this series is by no means unusual.
That whole corridor where it was originally this Hotel Transylvania sequel, where it was originally scheduled, is getting a little bit tight. I mean, we're seeing already this crowding in the back half of the summer where it makes a little bit of sense to move it. I'm still not sure they moved it to a place where it can absolutely have clear air, some open road in front of it. We'll have to see.
Now, that late summer, early autumn corridor may be rather crowded, Daniel, as you note, but thankfully we are looking at a situation where we will have more screens open and available to play those films as the European market continues its recovery process. Our feature interview this week involves just that, specifically the reopening of cinemas in the UK.
Now, it's been a month or so since the UK reopened. It was supposed to get rid of all of its pandemic restrictions this week, actually. But unfortunately, due to a new variant of COVID-19, that is going slower than expected. So to get an update on where the UK market is now, where it's headed, we'd like to welcome our guest, Phil Clapp. He is the CEO of the UK Cinema Association and the president of UNIC, the trade body representing cinemas across Europe. A couple of questions to go through. I guess let's start at the top. What is the status of UK cinemas today?
So UK cinemas were able to open from mid-May onwards. The way this has been dealt with over the last 14 or 15 months is that the restrictions on cinemas have been on a nation-by-nation basis in the UK. So England, Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland have all been treated slightly differently. But there was a process towards the end of the latest lockdown where there was at least some alignment. So through May, end of May, cinemas are allowed to reopen. We're at a place now where something like 90% of cinemas across the UK are open, and those that have not opened are those that for whom the current social distancing makes it not economically viable to do so. So they tend to be very small venues where social distancing cuts down the capacity to a point where actually it's hardly worth opening the doors, to be honest. Across the piece, there's social distancing in place, which means that capacities are limited to something like 50% or less of normal times. And since we reopened in May, I think everyone's been very pleased by the response of audiences. We're currently dealing with the challenges of the European Soccer Championships, which always in COVID times or non-COVID times has a hit on audiences. And for the first time in, I think, probably living memory, 3 of the 4 UK nations are involved in that. So it's a triple whammy, as it were. And then, probably not quite in living memory, but not recent memory, we've had an unusually warm summer until the last few days. So that has also had an impact. But all that notwithstanding, I think, people are very pleased with the response of audiences and pleased with the response of audiences once they've returned in terms of how safe and enjoyable they felt the experience.
Could you tell me a little bit about that run-up to the May reopening, which was essentially the second big reopening, and what were some of the lessons between that first period of closures, and how did that influence the priorities during that second period of closures as you were, I don't know if better prepared is the right way to say it, but handling another type of situation during this crisis?
Sure. So we were allowed to, we had the first lockdown in March of last year, and then really cinemas only began to open again from July of last year for what in the end turned out to be a quite limited period of 2 to 3 months before we had a second lockdown. And I think, not least given the fact that the slate of films wasn't as strong as we'd like, and given the fact that there was a great deal of uncertainty, that was not really a kind of full-blooded reopening. And it was really, although we clearly didn't see it at the time as that, it was really a kind of test run for where we came from in May of this year. So learning around the safety protocols, learning around customers' response to the safety protocols and the extent to which customers do or do not take responsibility for their own safety. So as we approached, and it was a very long run up to the reopening in May, I think we were very confident that cinemas were able to deliver a safe and enjoyable experience without it being overly regimented or overly medicalized, if I can use that as a phrase, essentially. But undoubtedly, there were some cinemas that weren't able to open last year for whom this was a new experience. There were also some cinemas whereby we've had a furlough scheme in operation over in the UK. And I think it differs from the furlough scheme in one or two other territories because staff who are on furlough are able to take other jobs at the same time. So there was a good deal of uncertainty, I think, particularly amongst the larger circuits about whether all staff would return, whether they'd found other better paying or more enjoyable or other jobs that they were more confident of having a return to. But in the end, I think, notwithstanding a few local difficulties, all of that played out as well as we could have hoped. Staff returned, staff were already aware of the safeguarding protocols. Usefully, many customers were now used to many of the things which were underway in cinemas, either because they'd been to the cinema or because they'd seen it in other retail and other leisure, for example. So face coverings, which is not something that the UK public have really been used to before, unlike some other territories, issues of social distancing, etc. So we had a head start, I think, in May compared to where we would have been otherwise. But that still doesn't mean that we could be complacent. And I think, all the signs that we've had from surveys of customers in the run-up to reopening and post-reopening suggest that in terms of that safeguarding piece and in terms of that welcoming back piece, we've done as well as can be expected, notwithstanding, whatever decisions our government or other UK governments take in terms of when those safeguards will be relaxed.
Now, you mentioned that furlough scheme for UK cinema workers. We've seen very different approaches in how local governments support the arts and support the cultural sector here in the US, in Europe. What has been the situation in the UK? What support have you seen and what really hasn't been there so far?
So there's been a good deal of what you might call kind of general business support. So the furlough scheme was essentially open to all business sectors. And for kind of broadly termed hospitality, leisure and retail, and cinema clearly touches a number of those buttons, there have been additional elements of help. So all cinemas, indeed all businesses, pay kind of local business taxes. And those have been suspended for 12 months, and they've now extended that suspension for a further 6 months. The VAT, the additional kind of sales tax, which is on cinema tickets and other venue tickets, that's been reduced from 20% down to 5%. Although, to be perfectly honest, for most of that time, cinemas haven't been open. So it's been, kind of there in readiness. And I think we're very much hopeful that it will be an additional benefit. And very much, as is the case in the US, for smaller venues, there has been additional direct funding from government. We've had nothing like the challenges that I know US colleagues have in accessing that, although it's not always been as straightforward as we might have liked. And again, that's something which has been dealt with on a nation by nation basis. So in England, for example, there have been 2 rounds of that funding, as there have in Scotland, whereas colleagues in Wales and Northern Ireland have only had 1 round of that, and there's discussions about a second round now, not least given the ongoing uncertainty about further relaxation. So we can be nothing but grateful for the support that's been there, and undoubtedly things like the furlough scheme and for the smaller operators, the direct funding they received have been a huge support and benefit. We did, as you would imagine, lobby the UK government for funding support for the larger operators. The reality of the market in the UK is that the largest 6 or 7 operators are 80% of the market. And, you could have spent, and government did spend, significant effort and resource supporting smaller operators without really understanding that the critical mass of the market is somewhere else, as it were. But as I've seen in other European territories, and I know it's the case in the US, government were very loath to be seen to be supporting big corporations. I think the optics of that for government are not always the most straightforward or easy, despite the impact and the benefit that would have. So those companies have had to rely on the more general business support. But we're in a place, we're not out of the woods yet, but we're in a place where actually we fully suspect that a tiny number of cinemas would have closed.
Oh, that's a fantastic news.
It is, and to be honest, no disrespect to those companies, but they were companies that were probably in distress before COVID, and all COVID really did was kind of hasten their demise. But, I think, through support from government and obviously through the hard work and commitment of the people running those companies, we're coming out of this. Actually, I would say not just the cinemas we went into it with, but within the last 4 to 6 weeks, we've had, 6 to 10 new cinemas open, for the first time, post-COVID. So no one's underestimating the challenges the industry faces and will continue to face. Right. But it's certainly not as bad an outcome as it might have been without that support.
Well, I think it's a huge concern, as you mentioned, if the major circuits that aren't eligible for, say, as much government support, if they represent 80% of the market, of course, that has a trickle-down effect on everybody else. The smaller players and the bigger players need to work together to have this presence, to have that footprint. I know it was a concern here in the U.S. where we did see bankruptcies. We did see some circuits, unfortunately, have to go out of business. It's refreshing to hear, that the situation now in the process of reopening hasn't been that critical in the UK, but also that 20% VAT tax is down to 5%. Talking about long-term changes, I really hope that's something that sticks for the UK public.
Yeah, I mean, to be honest, on the VAT change, we're one of, I think, probably only 2 or 3 European countries where cinemas and other cultural venues don't benefit from a reduced VAT level. I think the last time we looked at it, Denmark and Hungary and ourselves may have been the only 2 or 3. And certainly we, and as you'd imagine, others in the cultural sectors are definitely pushing government to make this a permanent change. Maybe not 20 down to 5, but some point in between in order to, kind of benefit and stimulate the economy. And I think, there are other learnings from this, not that we would have chosen to go into this to learn those things, that we will be coming back to government to talk to them about, So the truth of the matter is, and I'm always very conscious, my job is to support cinema operators, but there's a huge ecology of people outside of those who run cinemas and even putting to one side, if you can, colleagues in film distribution, be it the technology companies, seating, food and drink, ticketing, data analytics, screen advertising, who've been in the same, if not a worse position over the last 14 months, and getting government to understand the size and the importance of that economic footprint, I think is probably, kind of on the to-do list for us, because it's become abundantly apparent through talking to government during this last 14 months that those companies and those subsectors are nowhere on the radar of government. They're not seen as, they're not seen as part of the tech industry. They're not seen as part of media, but they're as important to us as is any other part of the ecology, I would say.
That's such a challenge, I think, worldwide, where at least for a lot of the general public and maybe some politicians, the image of our industry is just Hollywood producers, all this wealth, all this extravagance. But the reality is we have a lot of hourly wage workers around the world and a whole ecosystem, as you mentioned, of vendors that are here supporting this industry that have to wait for these cinemas to reopen. Now, take me back to that May reopening. We had a very different sort of approach to reopening here in the US, very fractured. It made the messaging uniquely difficult when you had a film in wide release only in some parts, not in others. I think one of the lessons that I learned from the UK market is when it can be a national sort of campaign, even when there are some exceptions, you see results like Tenet opening last summer in the UK and having a fairly good performance, even with those restrictions. What was the situation like when doors opened in May?
So as you say, although there was the additional complication of the 4 separate UK nations, England, Scotland and Wales, who are around kind of 95% of the UK market, they were all allowed to open on the 17th of May. So it was a less challenging proposition to message that, as it were. And certainly, I think one of the challenges which the major circuits over here who operate in, all or most of those different nations was the challenge they might have faced if they were kind of trying to fire up the central infrastructure for only cinemas in one nation rather than another. They were able to do that for the vast majority of their size. And it does, clearly last summer kind of showed us the impact that the closure of the US had on the willingness of the studios to release films globally. this time round, because of the fact that the US was where it was, there was more confidence of that. But we were able to offer a more kind of coherent picture to colleagues in distribution around releasing films. And although, as I say, the weather and other sporting distractions have got in the way for the last couple of weeks, that is a very kind of short-term challenge for us. And we're able to look forward to, as our other colleagues, obviously, a strong slate going forward, and the ability to message that and to do so with confidence that when we say a film is going to be released on X date, it is highly likely to be released on X date is a huge benefit for us. We're still in the place of kind of social distancing and in England at least capacity limits, so 50% capacity limit. And the plan had been that today, 21st of June, those limits would have been released. The arrival of a new variant and the vaccine program going phenomenally well, but still with some road to travel, means that the four governments have decided essentially to push that back by another 4 weeks to July the 19th. To be honest, at the moment, given, as I say, the other distractions, capacity is not the biggest challenge for us. But I think that when we get to July the 19th, the hope very much is that we can present that as a further kind of sense of the return to normality and kind of message that to customers. But certainly everyone is very confident that the sector will recover. Everyone is seeing very positive signs from those customers who have returned. And as the vaccine program in the UK now reaches down into younger people, although to be perfectly frank, they show no reluctance to return. It will be more straightforward, I think, to message around the return to cinema, and we'll start to see that kind of pick up some momentum, I think.
And how has the box office been looking like? I know Peter Rabbit 2 did fantastically well when it opened around close to that May reopening date. How have things been in the subsequent weeks?
So I think there's a sense of, it's not massive, but there's a sense of kind of steady momentum. So Peter Rabbit, you say, is now around 15 million in terms of box office, and is on a good trajectory still. We have a series of school holidays at various points. There's no coordination across the UK, so it has its own life in terms of cinemas. Quiet Place 2 is doing exceptionally well. There are other films like kind of Nomadland and The Father, which are picking up slightly different audiences.
Right, and more of a specialty audience.
Yeah, absolutely right. And I think, we're very conscious that probably, this is something which is clearly carried over from pre-COVID, but it's more important now. As we look at those audience segments which have returned, and equally as we look at those audience segments which haven't returned, we're going to need to think about which buttons we press in terms of programming to get older audiences in, et cetera, et cetera. But I think everyone's pleased with the early box office returns, but it's very early days. And I think, we understand that this is, given the size of the impact of COVID, not just in the UK, but globally, it's not something which is going to be undone in a matter of weeks. It's going to be months, and it's going to be, towards the end of the year, I think, before we're absolutely confident that we're tracking back to something like normality.
Well, hopefully examples like scoreless draws between England and Scotland can have audiences ready to return to be entertained for a change.
Absolutely. If we force people to watch turgid football like that on a regular basis, then cinemas will be filled to the rafters.
Surprises never cease in this 2020-2021 period. But as we look at the second half of the year here in the cinema industry, from the UKCA's perspective, what are your biggest priorities? What are you guys going to be focusing the most as we close out a difficult reopening year?
I think we need to be, clearly we will continue to do the triage, as it were, with our members. Not, as I say, 90% of cinemas are now open, and those 10% that aren't open tend to be the smaller venues for whom social distancing makes it not economically viable to do so. And they will come online, I'm sure, post the 19th of July, we hope, when those restrictions are reduced. And they'll be on a slightly different trajectory and probably need a little bit more love and care than those who are further ahead. But I think, we will continue to deal with issues as they arise for individual members, but also I think act as a bit of an echo chamber in terms of the positivity that's out there. Not every week is going to be a great week, and not every, kind of film is going to be a hit, but that's back to normality, to be perfectly honest. That's the ebb and flow that we were all used to pre-COVID. So I think it's about ensuring, and I think we have helped to ensure that the foundations are in place for recovery. I think it's about, giving a helping hand to those smaller operator members primarily, because that's the nature of what we do. But I think it's also about looking to the medium and the long term. We've lived a life over the last 14 months of, kind of dealing with blows as they arrive and working our best way out of them. And there's not really been either the headspace or the opportunity to do some more kind of longer term strategic planning. And I think it's about trying to support our members in thinking, what does the medium and the long term picture look like? There's a discussion underway in the UK, as I'm sure there is in most other territories, that with people having worked from home for the last 14 months and a gradual return to the office, but I think no great appetite to get back to where we were, where people are in the office 5 days a week, then how does the cinema sector deal with that? How does it provide something which appeals to people who not have more leisure time, but who have leisure time at different times, as it were? So I think, we will continue to do that twin track of, immediate help and support and longer term strategic planning, and recognize, if the last 14 months has shown us anything, it's shown how globally connected the industry is. So, that's not just, me and my day job in the UK, that's talking to Loria and colleagues at UNIC, the European trade body, that's talking to John Fithian and colleagues at NATO, and talking to colleagues in other territories, just to get a sense of the direction of the travel of the business and, the things we need to be aware of to do our jobs better, I think.
Thanks again to Phil Clapp for joining us this week. And Daniel, thank you for conducting that interview. That was terrific. The Box Office Podcast is produced by recordeditpodcast.com and the Box Office Company. Daniel, Rebecca, great to talk to the both of you as always, and can't wait to do it again next week.
And a quick reminder to our listeners, CinemaCon registrations are open. The event is taking place at the end of August in sunny and very hot Las Vegas, Nevada, where we will all be inside of a casino for the entirety of the week. Go to cinemacon.com for information on how to register. And don't forget to tune in next week on Thursday when we will go over the box office results on the opening weekend of F9 here in North America. For you listeners that want to get an idea of how much we're expecting the film to gross in its opening weekend, go to boxofficepro.com, where our chief analyst Sean Robbins will be publishing his weekly weekend forecast. Thanks again.